Hello, and welcome to Supplemental Lecture 3. This time you are not able to see my face, and that's because I want to make sure you get as full a view of the screen as possible, because today we are going to be looking at QGIS. Now, this is something we are going to do in session 1, and something that we're going to be spending a lot of time with over the next few weeks. But I wanted to provide this video as a supplement so that you have a good callback in case you can't recall exactly what we did in the lecture, or you're having trouble loading the bigger recordings. I think it's good to have this as a fallback for making sure you know where relevant menus are. So for this course, as outlined in the introductory email you will have received, we are going to be using QGIS 3.16. I put an asterisk here because QGIS 3.16 is the long-term release. It is the stable current release. QGIS is a community-driven software that is constantly under development, and in the next 6 months or so, there'll be another LTR or long-term release published. Some folks have already let me know that they've had some issues with 3.16. This is not uncommon with a new long-term release, especially if your machine has a particular setup. There are lots of potential reasons why this program could be unstable potentially on your machine. If you find 3.16 is an issue, I encourage you to come to the pre-course installation Q&A session, which will be happening, well, the details are in the email. I believe it should be happening about an hour before session 1 on our first day together. And I'll try to troubleshoot those issues. Thankfully, there are lots of really great guides online on installation. And while I will talk about installation a bit here, I just wanted to give you a heads up that if you're having trouble, it's probably not your fault. It's probably just the way the QGIS release is interacting on your machine. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be looking at QGIS for the first time. And I'm going to very quickly take you through and show you a few different key menus that you're going to have to return to. I'll even show you the act of loading in some data, and we'll have a play with manipulating that data a bit, which is something we're going to do live in the webinar in session 2 in quite a bit of detail. Before we can even do anything with QGIS, though, we need to install it. Now, as you can see, I already have QGIS open. You can already start to take in the beauty of QGIS. But what I want to show you first is the website. So when you go to qgis.org, there's a lot of great documentation here. And there's 2 key things I want to show you. The first is this download now button. And already this machine recognizes, the website recognizes that I'm on a Mac machine, hence why it's already opened this menu for me. But there are some relatively simplistic instructions on how to install different versions of QGIS on your machine. Like I said, 3.16 is the one we're going for. And depending on your machine, you can follow the installation instructions in the reading I've set for this week. Furthermore, you can go to this page. If I open this in another tab, the all downloads link, and there's a bit more detail on different systems and how you install QGIS on different systems. I will say, even though there are problems doing this, certainly, I know lots of people struggle with this step. This is a lot better than it used to be, I can assure you. They've added a lot more documentation. And there's some good guides online if you want to dig into this a bit more. The other thing I want to draw your attention to on the QGIS website is the manual, which used to be, yes, sorry, the QGIS user guide. There's also a training manual with some example data sets, but how you get here, you go to For Users, you check the documentation, and you click on QGIS User Guide. It's also docs.qgis.org. And this is for the current 3.16 version. If you decide to use a different version, you're going to have to load the documentation from that other version. And you can see I can click on those here. There is a ton of information in these documentation guides. If I just click on one at random, you can see there's quite a bit of detail about how you work with different software. And what's really great about the guide is it provides icons that tell you which tool to click and which options to select to make your model or your desired analysis work. There's also hidden at the bottom a Python developer cookbook, it's called, for learning how to do scripting in QGIS. This is something we're going to talk about a bit in session 4, but this is the sort of reference manual for using Python in QGIS. So that's the website. And once you've downloaded the installer, whether you're on Windows and you've installed OSGeo, or you're on Mac and you've directly downloaded the DMG file, or you're on Linux and you've done something specific to your machine, once you have the software booted up, you'll open it. And this is, you'll see something like this. I don't want to say you'll see exactly this because I've actually customized my QGIS to look a bit different than yours. And actually, just to give you, oh, sorry about that, was preparing for a class. If I give you a moment, you can admire my love of memes here. I'm just going to open QGIS from the beginning. Okay, ignore that error. We'll talk more about that later. This is what QGIS looks like when you first open it up. I didn't want to give you a preview of anything like that. Also here, you can see some examples of some of the projects I've been working on in QGIS, shown in the recent projects window. If this is your first time loading it in, what you're going to want to do is select the project templates. You're going to double click that. And that's going to open this blank white map with nothing else showing other than these icons and potentially browser setup over here. You may not even see some of these windows, so I'll show you how to turn them on and off. But what we're going to start with is the very first thing you should see when you load in QGIS, and that is this, the browser menu. The browser menu selected here is your navigation portal for finding files on your machine. And it's also the place where you can set up remote connections to databases on the web, on the internet. You actually see I have one of these web connections open here. What I'm going to do is drill down into some of the files that I have. And what I'm doing here is I've set up some favorites, but you could start from your root machine directory, which on Mac will appear as, I believe, this / here. Go to users, and then you can sort of drill down through and access where your files are found. I'm just giving you kind of a peek into what I do under the hood. But once we open this up, once I have a file or a folder path that I like, I can right click on that and say add as favorite, so I don't have to click through that every time. This is where you'll load data in. There are other methods of loading data in, which we'll talk about at a different point. But what I'm going to do to start, just so we have something to work with, is I'm going to load in a TIFF file. We'll talk more about TIFF files later. And you can simply double click on it or right click and say add layer to project. You now see there's this nice square black and white object that's been added to my screen. And if I select layers, then this file shows up as displayed on the canvas. Now we're going to have a lot more time to go through the layer menu, and I don't want to spend too much time here actually giving you a detailed breakdown of all the different options at play in the layer menu. But just from a starting point, since this is probably for many of you the first time you're using a software like this, layers are the GIS term for files that we've loaded into the project. And critically, they're displayed on the map in the order that they're ordered in the layers dialog. So if I were to add more layers in and I wanted this to be the backdrop, I would need to make sure those other layers are on top of this DEM file. You can also add layers using a range of different methods. And what you'll find is that there are 3 or 4 ways to do everything in QGIS. It's actually the same in ArcMap and really any other GIS software. And the reason for that is, I think, sort of built-in redundancy. So if there's a problem, you always have multiple ways to get your software working. So on the left here, there are a series of icons that have sort of corresponding shapes associated with them. And if I mouse over them, you may not be able to tell at this scale, but this icon reads add vector layer. This one reads add raster layer, add mesh layer, add delimited text layer. These are the buttons you'll click when you want to add a layer from somewhere else in your machine. If you don't like going through the browser, and in fact, in some cases, you don't want to go through the browser because you need to customize the import options, my recommendation for adding data is to always go through this add source method. So you can see you can actually access the browser here when you click the data source manager options, and then you can go through and select specific styles of file that you want to import. There's a range of options here. Many of you will never touch some of these, but the ones we're going to be seeing a lot of are vector, raster, delimited text, and geopackage. So get used to seeing these menus. You can also access the data source manager for importing data by going to layer, this top drop-down menu, add layer, and then you see all the options added here. Like I said, 3 to 4 ways to do everything in GIS. And I think this is where some of the confusion people have comes in, is trying to figure out where to go to access the things they need. Now, I told you at the very beginning that you may not see the layers in browser set up the same way I have here, and you certainly may not have this little block down here called overview. What I've done in setting up my QGIS is customize the view a bit. And while it's up to you, I would recommend you try to emulate me and have a similar setup. The way to do this is to go to View, which is this drop-down menu at the top here. And if I scroll down, there are lots of options of ways we can, hopefully it already starts to give you an idea. There's lots of different ways we can manipulate what we're looking at on a map, and lots of different tools for measuring, for doing statistics, for adding sort of decorative elements like scale bar and things that we're going to need when we actually make our map. But in order to give your view of the screen the same as mine, what you're going to go down to in View is the bottom. You're going to go to Panels. And what you want to make sure you have highlighted is Browser. Always have that highlighted. Layers. And then the one you may not have highlighted is Overview. And this is what I have highlighted here. The value of overview will come into play in sessions 2 and 3 when you'll see me working with lots of different layers. But what it basically allows me to do is to kind of have an overall picture. So if I'm zooming in and doing something really specific, you can see perhaps the small red box tells me exactly where I am in the sort of overall area I want to be working in. So it's actually a really great tool for knowing where you are when you're doing fine scale work, hence why I always have it up. So I recommend, again, you go to View, Panels, and you have these 3 panels open. You can see there are a ton of other panels, and I'm going to use a lot of these in our time together. One that I'm going to have open often is the processing toolbox. You can choose to have as many panels open as you like, and for certain tasks I'm going to set you, you're going to want to have many different panels open. So you can edit that right here. And while I'm here, just below that, you are able to customize the number of toolbars that show up on your screen. So you might be able to tell that my screen is absolutely cluttered with toolbars and icons. And that's just because I don't like to go looking for these tools in these menus. I like to be able to access them quickly with the click of a button. Hence, I always have all the toolbars that I usually use open. Some of these I don't use that regularly, but still just good to have. You are free to customize this however you like. Some of these toolbars we're not going to use very often. Some we're going to rely on a lot. So you'll get a feel for what works for you as we go. The key is to make sure that this software works for you. So while you can follow my recommendations for how to set up your software, a lot of the details are really up to you. Now, while I'm on the topic of appearance, I want to show you kind of the root system settings menu for QGIS. So on my Mac here, if I go to QGIS, I click Preferences. It's going to take a minute to load, but it's going to open this very long menu that gives me a lot of sort of base system settings I can set up. And something that you may not have at startup is you may not have the exact appearance of QGIS that I have. What I've done is I've done a fusion style of QGIS, and I've colored it so that it's a gray background. This is just something that I found quite nice when I discovered I could do this. I just like this appearance. I can also customize the icon size. You can see sometimes the menus on these get broken down. But if you have trouble seeing or bad eyesight, or you have other sort of accessibility needs, you can customize the fonts, the text size, all the different features of the base system here under general settings after going to QGIS preferences. And you can always access preferences via a shortcut. On Windows, this will be different, but on Mac, it's Command, comma. There are a ton of other options here. One thing that Mac users in particular might need to do at one point is set up their environment paths. We will cross that bridge when we get there. I promise I'll circle back to that if needed. You can also set up your default coordinate reference system. If you've watched Supplementary Lecture 2, you now know all about coordinate systems, so you can set up the coordinate system you'd prefer right here. You can also set up customized datum transformations or projections as well. And you can set default color scales and all sorts of other different features. We will be coming back into this preferences menu a good bit because there's some features we need to adjust as we go through the project. But for the most part, this is not a menu you need to open often. It's just a menu you need to know where it is. If there's a problem with your installation, it likely, especially if you're on Mac or Linux, might be coming down to this area, the settings and environment area in these preference options. So this is just something to keep in mind here. All right. So we've looked at the browser, we've looked at the layer, I've shown you how to turn panels and toolbars on and off, showed you the overview panel, the preferences. I want to take a moment to highlight plugins as well, because this is something that I talk about in the introductory email. I've asked you to install certain plugins. These are community-driven extensions that people have written and sometimes maintained for years. Some of these plugins have actually been so useful that they've been adapted by the QGIS developers and made permanent features of the software. I've asked you to download quite a few plugins, but not all the ones I have active on my machine. Some of these just aren't necessarily going to be useful for you. The ones that really matter, Easy Custom Labeling is one of the best plugins on QGIS, period. Labeling is a notoriously difficult component of GIS work. If you've ever done labeling on a map in ArcMap, you know the pain I'm talking about. Easy Custom Labeling makes this a bit more manageable, and I really enjoy the interface for it. There's also a plugin that allows you to use Google Earth Engine, which is a remote sensing software developed by Google that I'm going to highlight in session 4, which I think is really a game changer for GIS, particularly for early career researchers, making it more accessible to do remote sensing. We also have Quick Map Services is, again, one of the most essential plugins to have. This allows you to add base maps to your map. And another good one to have is something like SRTM Downloader. This is one that, again, allows you to download base maps and reference data sets really easily. Lots of other different options here. Group Stats is another one to do statistics on your software, on your data, sorry. And Memory Layer Saver. You can read the description of these in the PDF guide and go to the documentation to learn more about them. But in order to install a plugin, you see I already have all these installed. You need to go to the Not Installed menu and look these up. So if I look up Memory, you can see it doesn't show up because I already have it installed. But if I wanted to install, say, I don't know, this particular very specific plugin, first, I'm not even sure what this is for. Then I click this button down at the bottom. All right. So the next thing I want to highlight is the layout menu. And this is something that, well, I suppose the more important thing to highlight here is actually the properties dialog. So when we're looking at a layer, we can access sort of the properties of that layer and manipulate how it appears on the map, as well as sort of different quantitative features by right-clicking on the layer in the layer dialog, hitting properties, and it brings up all these different menus here. We're going to be going through each of these menus in quite a bit of detail through the course, but I just wanted to show you where these features are. For instance, if I wanted to change the color scheme here for this particular layer that I've loaded, I can do that right here. Now, this is not a very pleasant color scheme that I've applied, and this is something that I could adjust in the properties layer. But this is just to show you how you get access to that. The final bit I'll highlight for now because we're going to be going through this in a lot more detail, is the processing toolbox. This is where your analytical side of your workflow is going to come into play. There are a lot of different tools available in the processing toolbox to manipulate data in all sorts of different ways. We're going to be working with quite a few of these tools as we go through the course, but I basically encourage you at this stage to explore this menu and start to familiarize yourself with some of the tools. If, say, I want to analyze this raster layer that I've loaded, I can double click the cell statistics tool in the processing toolbox. And what comes up is a very rich dialogue that provides me with a ton of documentation on how the tool works and provides me with drop-down menus and checkboxes to work out what I want to get out of this particular tool. In this case, if I wanted to calculate the standard deviation of the essentially the height data that's stored in this DEM file, I would set this here, make sure that I'm happy with these advanced parameters, though you often don't have to touch these. And then if I click run, well, the point being, yes. Yes, so what I've selected here is a tool that's actually a bit more complicated than the single layer I've loaded. This tool allows you to compute the standard deviation with respect to a reference layer. So I probably want to not use the same layer here. If I run this, I'm not going to get very useful results. But the point being that once I've loaded in all these different options in the processing toolbox, I can hit run, and I will produce a layer when I've optimized this properly. We're going to be using a lot of these processing tools as we go. A key thing to know, and I'm saying this now because this is probably going to come up through the course, for some reason, there are some tools of the same name in the processing toolbox, which you access by clicking either this button at the top here or going to view and opening the processing panel. There are differences between the tools listed here and tools of the same name on the vector and raster dropdowns. Now, vector and raster, the two main data types in GIS, we'll review what that means in session 2. But I can't remember exactly off the top of my head which tools are the ones that have similar but slightly different applications. But in these menus, you'll find some tools that you can also find in the processing toolbox, but they actually do different things. So it's just something to be aware. So when I recommend in this course which tool to use, that's kind of something to mark down and keep a note of. You may end up finding that a named tool in a different menu in QGIS might be might not produce the same results. This is something QGIS is working on, but the basic reason behind it is the processing toolbox is a separate module, and the tools there were compiled by slightly different groups of people over different ranges of time. So there are some slight inconsistencies between these two. This really comes into play when we want to work with the model builder, which is something I'll highlight in session 4. And one final processing thing I want to note is when you load a tool up like this, you can actually run a batch process. So this is something that you could also do via command line in Python, but by clicking run batch process, you can set the statistic you want to do. You could run this standard deviation calculation over 50 raster files and have them all produce similarly systematically named layers as the output. All right. So I've shown you where layer properties are. I've shown you processing toolbox. That is all I want to highlight for now. There are obviously many more menus to drill down into here. I haven't even touched on some of the project menus, the layer menu, and some of the intricacies of the other tools we're going to be working with. The key now is, now that I've showed you some of the main tools to work with, that you start exploring on your own. And as I introduce tasks for making our hazard assessment for the volcano Guagua Pichincha, that you just start exploring and getting used to where these options and tools are. So that's all I have for now. Thank you for your time, and see you in the next supplementary lecture or in our meeting on Wednesday.